The universe you imagine does not exist. The mind demands edges. It searches for limits the way a body searches for ground beneath its feet. It wants a boundary where everything stops, a final surface where existence ends and nothing begins. The question forms automatically. How big is it? It feels simple. It feels logical. It feels necessary. But the moment that question appears, it carries a hidden assumption, one so deeply embedded that it goes unnoticed. It assumes there is something outside the universe, something beyond it, something from which its size can be measured. That assumption is false. Size is not an inherent property. It is not something objects possess in isolation. Size only exists through comparison. A mountain is large because it is compared to a human. A star is massive because it is compared to a planet. Measurement requires two things: the object and a reference outside or alongside it. Remove the reference, and size collapses into meaninglessness. The universe includes everything, every particle, every field, every possible frame of reference. There is no external vantage point, no outside observer, no place where a ruler can be held against its edge, because there is no edge. So the question fails before it even begins. It is not that the universe is too large to measure. It is that measurement itself cannot apply. This is where perception begins to fracture. The mind evolved to survive within limited environments. It understands rooms, distances, horizons. It knows how far to walk, how high to climb, how long until night falls. Every concept of size it holds is rooted in finite local experience. But the universe is not local. It is not bounded in the way objects are bounded. It does not sit inside something larger. Trying to measure it is like trying to step outside existence itself. There is nowhere to stand. Even the language begins to break under pressure. Words like big, small, infinite, or finite rely on frameworks that do not apply at this level. They are tools built for navigating reality, not for defining it. In physics, distance itself is not absolute. It depends on the observer, on motion, on gravity. Space is not a rigid grid stretching uniformly in all directions. It is dynamic. It bends. It warps. It expands. So even if the universe had a size, it would not be fixed. It would not be the same for every observer. It would not remain stable long enough to define. The idea of a single objective measurement dissolves, and with it, the comfort of certainty. The mind resists this. It tries to replace the broken idea with something else. It reaches for the concept of infinity as if that solves the problem. If there is no edge, then it must be infinite. But infinity is not a size. It is the absence of size. It is not a measurement. It is a statement that measurement has failed. Even worse, the universe may not be infinite. It could be finite, yet without boundaries, curved in ways that loop back on themselves, curved in ways that loop back on themselves. A structure where traveling far enough in one direction does not lead to an edge, but returns to the starting point. In such a reality, asking for size becomes meaningless again. There is no edge to define it, no outside to compare it to. The question collapses no matter which direction the mind turns. This is not a limitation of the universe. It is a limitation of perception. The mind was never designed to comprehend systems without boundaries. It was never meant to operate without reference points. It builds models that simplify reality into manageable pieces. Objects, distances, beginnings, endings. But those models are approximations. They are not truth. And when pushed beyond their limits, they begin to fail. The universe does not conform to intuition. It does not reshape itself to fit expectation. It exists independently of understanding, indifferent to whether it can be conceptualized. So the demand for its size reveals something deeper. It reveals the need for control, the need to reduce existence into something measurable, something containable, something that can be grasped. But there is nothing to grasp. No outer boundary, no final scale, no ultimate measurement, only a system that contains all. Systems, including the one trying to define it. And in that realization, something breaks. Not the universe, but the illusion that it can ever be fully understood through the frameworks the mind depends on. What feels like space is not what exists. It appears vast, empty, stretched between objects like a silent container holding everything in place. The mind imagines it as a stage, an invisible backdrop where galaxies drift, where stars ignite, where matter moves through a passive void. But that image is wrong. Space is not a container. It does not exist independently, waiting to be filled. It is not there in the way objects are there. It is a structure defined by relationships, distances between events, not a thing that holds them. Remove the objects, remove the events, and space itself loses meaning. This is the first fracture. The second is deeper. What is called matter feels solid, stable, undeniable. The body feels dense. The world feels tangible. Touch reinforces the illusion. Pressure, resistance, weight. Everything seems real in the most direct sense, but physics dismantles this completely. Atoms, the building blocks of everything visible, are almost entirely empty. Not metaphorically empty, literally empty. If the nucleus were the size of a grain of sand, the electrons would orbit meters away. The space in between, nothing solid, no structure, no substance. Over 99.9999% of what is perceived as physical reality is empty space. The solidity felt is not real in the way it seems. It is the result of electromagnetic forces, fields interacting, repulsion at the quantum level, preventing atoms from passing through each other. There is no true contact. The hand never actually touches anything. It hovers, held apart by invisible forces, while the mind translates that interaction into the sensation of touch. So the body, every part of it, is not a solid object. It is a dynamic pattern, a temporary arrangement of particles and fields. And those particles, they are not solid either. They are not tiny spheres or miniature objects. They do not have definite positions until measured. They exist as probabilities, wave functions describing where they might be, not where they are. Reality, at its most fundamental level, is not made of things. It is made of interactions, fluctuations, vibrations, excitations in underlying fields. This means the concept of stuff begins to dissolve. The idea that the universe is made of solid components arranged in space is an illusion built from limited perception. There is no solid foundation, only patterns within patterns. And the space those patterns seem to occupy, it is not empty in the way imagined. Even a perfect vacuum is not truly empty. Quantum fluctuations constantly generate and destroy particles. Energy flickers in and out of existence. The void is unstable, active, alive with uncertainty. So there is no true emptiness, and there is no true solidity, only a shifting network of relationships that the mind interprets as objects in space. This is where the question of size begins to collapse even further, because size assumes extension through space. It assumes there is a measurable distance between boundaries. It assumes there is something solid enough, stable enough to define edges. But there are no true edges. Objects do not have sharp boundaries at the fundamental level. Particles blur into probabilities. Fields overlap. Distinctions become fuzzy, undefined. Even the idea of location becomes uncertain. At quantum scales, a particle does not have a precise position until it is observed. Before that, it exists in a spread of possibilities. Not here, not there, not anywhere in the classical sense. So, where exactly is anything? The question stops making sense, and if location itself is you and certain, then distance, space between locations becomes uncertain as well, which means the entire framework required to define size is unstable. The mind tries to hold on to familiar concepts. It tries to rebuild the world in a way that feels solid again. It imagines space as a grid, particles as points, distances as fixed. But these are approximations, simplifications that work at human scales, not at the level where reality is actually defined. At deeper levels, there is no grid, no fixed background, no absolute structure, only relationships, only interactions, only a constantly shifting web of energy and information. And within that web, what is perceived as the universe is not a thing with a clear boundary or measurable extent. It is an emergent structure, a pattern arising from deeper rules that do not resemble the world experienced. So when the question returns, what is the size of the universe? It carries the weight of all these broken assumptions. It assumes space is real in a classical sense. It assumes matter is solid. It assumes boundaries exist. It assumes location is definite. None of these assumptions survive contact with physics. The universe is not built from objects sitting in space. It is built from relationships that create the illusion of both. And when that illusion is stripped away, the question of size is no longer difficult. It is meaningless, because there is nothing fundamentally solid, nothing precisely located, and no true container in which everything resides. Only a shifting structure that the mind translates into a world that feels stable, a translation that works just well enough to survive, but not well enough to reveal the truth. The question of size assumes something silent but critical, that the universe exists as a fixed object in time. It assumes there is a single moment, a universal now, a frozen state of reality that can be measured, defined, and understood all at once. That assumption is false. Time is not absolute. It does not flow the same for everything. It does not tick at a universal rate. It is not a background clock counting seconds for the entire universe. It bends, it stretches, it distorts, depending on motion and gravity. Clocks do not agree. A clock moving at high speed slows down relative to one at rest. A clock deep in a gravitational field ticks slower than one far away. These are not illusions or measurement errors. They are real, experimentally confirmed effects. This means there is no single timeline that everything shares, no universal present moment, where the entire universe exists simultaneously in the same state. The idea of now is local, personal, limited. And without a universal now, the concept of measuring the universe as a whole begins to collapse. Because what exactly is being measured? The universe at what moment? From whose perspective? There is no answer that holds universally. Two observers moving differently or experiencing different gravitational fields will not agree on the timing of events. What appears simultaneous to one may not be simultaneous to another. So the universe does not present a single, consistent snapshot that can be measured. It presents countless overlapping realities, each defined by the observer within it. This alone is enough to fracture the idea of size, but it goes deeper. The universe is not static. It is not sitting still, waiting to be measured. It is expanding. Galaxies are not simply moving through space. They are being carried apart as space itself stretches. The distance between distant galaxies increases over time, not because they are traveling through a fixed backdrop, but because the backdrop itself is changing. Space is dynamic. This creates a paradox for the mind. If the universe is expanding, then its size is increasing. But increasing relative to what? There is no external space into which it expands, no outer region waiting to be filled. The expansion is internal. Distances within the universe grow, but there is no outside reference point to define that growth against. It is change without an external frame. And because time itself is relative, even that change cannot be described universally. Different observers will measure different expansion rates depending on their position and motion. What is seen from one galaxy will not match what is seen from another. So the universe does not have a single agreed upon size at any moment, because there is no single moment and no single perspective. The question begins to dissolve completely. There is another layer, more unsettling. At extreme distances, parts of the universe are moving away so fast, due to the expansion of space, that their light will never reach certain observers. Entire regions are permanently disconnected, not because of distance alone, but because of the structure of space-time itself. This creates horizons, limits to what can ever be observed, not temporary limits, absolute ones. There are parts of the universe that will remain forever inaccessible, forever unmeasurable, forever outside any possible interaction. So even if the mind insists on defining a size, it can only ever define a partial one, a visible region, a limited horizon, not the whole. never the whole, and that visible region changes depending on the observer. Again, the idea, a single objective size, disappears. Then comes the final fracture. Time may not even be fundamental. Some theories in physics suggest that time emerges from deeper, more basic structures, that what is experienced as the flow of time is not a fundamental property of reality, but a consequence of how information is processed and how entropy increases. Entropy, the measure of disorder, always increases. This gives direction to time. It creates the illusion of past, present, and future. But at the deepest level, the equations of physics often do not prefer a direction. They work the same forward or backward, which means the flow of time may not exist in the way it feels. It may be another construct, another layer of interpretation. And if time itself is not fundamental, then the idea of a universe evolving through time, growing, expanding, having a size at each moment, becomes even less stable. The foundation disappears. So the question, what is the size of the universe, is not just difficult. It is built on assumptions that do not survive contact with reality. It assumes a fixed universe. It assumes a shared timeline. It assumes a stable frame of reference. None of these exist. Instead, there is a shifting structure of space-time, where distances change, time bends, and observation defines reality in ways the mind cannot fully grasp. There is no single moment to measure, no single perspective to trust, no fixed state to define. And in that instability, the concept of size collapses completely. Because you cannot measure what never stands still. The mind resists what cannot be controlled. It reaches for certainty, the way a hand reaches for something solid in the dark. It wants the universe to be defined, measurable, structured, in a way that can be understood and contained, not because it is true, but because it is tolerable, because a measurable universe feels safer. If the universe has a size, then it has limits. If it has limits, then it can be understood. If it can be understood, then existence feels less chaotic. But none of that is required to be true. The universe does not bend to comfort. It does not adjust itself to match expectation. It does not simplify itself for comprehension. It does not care whether it makes sense. And this is where the deepest resistance appears, not in logic, but in identity. Because the idea of a measurable universe is tied to the idea of significance. A defined system implies structure. Structure implies hierarchy. Hierarchy implies position. And the mind wants a position that matters. It wants to believe it exists somewhere meaningful, somewhere central, somewhere that gives its existence weight. But physics removes that possibility completely. There is no center of the universe, not hidden, not unknown, non-existent. Every point in space can be treated as the center from its own frame of reference. The expansion of the universe looks the same from any location. Galaxies recede in all directions, no matter where observation occurs, so there is no privileged position. No special location where reality is anchored. The place occupied is not central. It is not unique. It is not important in any cosmic sense. It is just one coordinate in a system that does not prioritize anything. This is not philosophical. It is structural. And it doesn't stop there. The scale alone is enough to collapse any sense of importance. Hundreds of billions of galaxies, each containing hundreds of billions of stars, each star potentially surrounded by planets. The numbers are so large they lose meaning. They cannot be visualized. They cannot be internalized. And within that scale, the existence of a single human life becomes almost indistinguishable from zero. Not metaphorically, mathematically. This is where the ego fractures, because it is built on contrast, on difference, on the assumption that existence has weight relative to something else. But in a system without a center, without boundaries, without absolute scale, that contrast disappears. There is no reference against which importance against which becomes becomes lock, all temporary, constructed, not fundamental. Even identity begins to dissolve under this pressure. The body is not fixed. It is constantly changing. Atoms replaced, cells dying and regenerating. Over time, almost none of the original material remains. So what is the self? Not a stable object, a process, a pattern maintained briefly before it dissolves. Consciousness itself, what feels like the core of existence, is not a separate entity observing the universe. It is a product of the same physical laws, neural activity, electrical signals, chemical interactions. There is no separation. The observer is part of the system being observed. This destroys another illusion, the idea of standing outside reality, looking in. There is no outside. There is no detached perspective from which the universe can be judged, measured, or understood completely. Only internal views, limited views, temporary views. The mind wants to believe it is special because it can think about the universe, because it can ask questions about existence. But the ability to ask questions does not grant importance. It And awareness does not change the structure of reality. The universe does not recognize observers as special entities. It does not assign meaning to consciousness. It does not elevate thought above matter. Everything operates under the same rules, blindly, indifferently. Stars collapse. Galaxies collide. Galaxies collide. Particles interact. Entropy increases. None of it depends on awareness. None of it changes because something is observing it. This is the harsh realization the mind avoids. Existence is not centered around perception. Reality does not require meaning. The universe is not constructed with intention. And within that, the idea of measuring its size becomes even more fragile, because the need to measure comes from the need to understand. And the need to understand comes from the need to feel grounded, but there is no requirement for grounding, only the expectation of it. So the question persists. How big is the universe? Not because it has an answer, but because the mind cannot accept the absence of one. It cannot accept a reality that does not resolve into something clear. But the absence of an answer is the answer. There may be no edge or a boundary that cannot be reached, or structure that loops back on itself in dimensions that cannot be visualized, or something even less intuitive, something that does not align with any concept currently available. And none of these possibilities restore importance. None of them place existence at the center. None of them justify the need for meaning. They only reinforce the same conclusion. The universe does not need to be measurable. It does not need to be understandable. And it does not need to make room for significance. The demand for these things comes from the mind, not from reality. What remains when size disappears? Not emptiness, not chaos, not nothing. What remains is structure without scale. A network of relationships that does not depend on absolute measurements. A system where everything is defined only by how it connects, not by how large it is. This is where perception must be rebuilt, because everything the mind relies on, distance, size, position, time, has been stripped of its assumed stability. What felt fundamental has been exposed as conditional. What felt real has been reduced to approximation. So the question is no longer about the universe. It is about how reality is interpreted. The mind constructs a model. It simplifies. It compresses complexity into manageable concepts, objects, locations, durations. It creates a world that feels solid, continuous, measurable, but that world is not the raw structure of existence. It is a translation, a useful one, a necessary one, but still a distortion. At deeper levels, there are no objects in the way they are perceived. No fixed boundaries separating one thing from another. No absolute distances locking everything into place. There are only interactions, only relationships, only a constantly shifting configuration of energy and information that does not require a fixed scale to exist. In this framework, asking for size is like asking for the weight of a relationship. It applies a property that does not belong. The universe is not an object sitting somewhere. It is the totality of interactions themselves. There is no external frame, no higher level from which it can be measured, no final perspective where everything becomes clear. Every observation is internal. Every measurement is relative. Every attempt to define the whole is made from within the system being defined. This creates a permanent limitation, not of knowledge, but of position. There is no escape from it. Even the concept of laws of physics begins to shift under this realization. These laws are not rules imposed from outside. They are descriptions of patterns observed from within. They reflect consistency in behavior, not an external authority governing reality. And those patterns may themselves emerge from deeper structures not yet understood. So what feels like a final explanation is only another layer, another approximation, another model. This means reality is not something that can be fully captured, not because it is too complex, but because the act of capturing requires separation, and there is no true separation available. There is no way to step outside the system to see it completely. Only partial views, only limited perspectives, only fragments of the whole. And yet, those fragments are all that exist for perception. This is the recalibration. not an answer, but a shift. The universe is not something with a size wall waiting to be discovered. It is not a problem waiting to be solved. It is not a structure designed to be fully understood. It is a self-contained system of relationships in which the observer is embedded. And that observer, what is called you, is not separate from it, not an independent entity looking at the universe from a distance, but a localized process within it, a temporary configuration of the same underlying structure. Thoughts, identity, awareness, all of it arises from the same interactions that govern stars and particles. There is no dividing line where the universe ends and the self begins. That boundary is constructed, not fundamental. So the attempt to define the universe, to measure it, to assign it a size, is also an attempt to define the limits of existence self. And that attempt fails for the same reason every time. Because there are no external limits to reference. Only internal relationships that never resolve into something absolute. This does not provide comfort. It removes it because it eliminates the idea that reality can be fully grasped, fully contained, fully reduced to something stable and complete. It replaces certainty with structure, clarity with abstraction, clarity with abstraction, control with recognition of limitation. But within that limitation is the closest approach to truth available. Not a final answer, but the understanding that the question itself was built on assumptions that do not hold. The universe does not have a size, because size requires an outside, and there is no outside. Only the system, only the relationships, only the unfolding structure that does not need to be measured to exist. And within it, a brief pattern forms aware enough to ask the question, but not separate enough to ever answer it.